Hi guys, how old are you? I'd love to see the age range of our viewers. Write your age below.
After skipping my birthday for the third year in a row, Mom handed me tea and said, "I know I messed up." I smiled and switched it with my sisters, the one who got Paris. 2 sips later, she couldn't breathe. I didn't flinch. That's the part that lives in people's heads. That quiet exchange of teacups, the slight curve at the corner of my lips, the panic erupting 2 seats away while I simply sat there, hands folded in my lap, as if I'd just heard someone drop a spoon, not watching my golden sister claw at her throat while Mom screamed into the phone. But you don't just get to that moment. You don't just arrive there, cool and calm and unblinking, unless something built it, unless years and years of small things, invisible things, stacked up so high inside you that you no longer cared whether it all came crashing down. And if I'm going to tell this story, you need to know that moment didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of 1,000 tiny goodbyes, I whispered to myself. Every time they celebrated her, and not me. My name is Heather. I'm 34. I work in clinical data research for a pharmaceutical company that most people have never heard of. And I've never been the kind of person who throws herself a birthday party or insists on being the center of attention. But I've also never been the kind of person who forgets someone else's. I remember birthdays, anniversaries, coffee orders, and weird dietary restrictions that come up once in passing. I remember because that's how I was raised. To notice things, to be helpful, to be low maintenance. I was the quiet one, the capable one, the one who didn't cry when my dad missed my recital, who didn't complain when Caroline got new clothes while mine were still in good shape, and who smiled when told, "You're just more mature, that's all." Caroline is 6 years younger than me, and she has always sparkled. You know the type. Soft voice, shiny hair, big eyes that widen at just the right moment, and a laugh that makes men lean in. Even as a child, she had this way of pulling people toward her like gravity. She got compliments from strangers in grocery stores, invitations to birthday parties I didn't even know were happening, and later modeling gigs and brand sponsorships on Instagram, while I sat in a fluorescent-lit office correcting data entries from interns who barely knew how to spell. And Mom, oh, Mom was enchanted. Every photo of Caroline was framed. Every tantrum was because she's sensitive. And every victory, big or small, was a reason to gather the family for a dinner in her honor. I was invited to those dinners too, of course, usually to help with the dishes. The first time they forgot my birthday, I thought maybe I'd mentioned the wrong date. I actually checked my calendar, convinced I was the one who'd gotten it wrong. It was the year I turned 31, and I had just transferred to a new division at work. The project I'd led, a data validation initiative, had saved the company over $500,000, and my boss had taken the whole team out for drinks that Friday. I'd driven home with a warm, stupid smile on my face, thinking maybe this year I'd come home to flowers, or even just a card. But the house was quiet. No voicemail from Mom, no text, not even from Caroline. I brushed it off. Things happen, people get busy, and told myself that 31 wasn't exactly a milestone. But the next year came and went the same way. I sent Mom a Mother's Day card that May and got a thumbs-up emoji in return. When my birthday rolled around in August, nothing, just radio silence. I told myself not to care, told myself it didn't matter. I bought my own cake, ate a slice in front of the TV, laughed too loudly at an old rerun, and pretended I didn't hear the silence ringing in my ears. Then came this year. 34, I didn't expect balloons, I didn't expect champagne, but I expected something. A phone call, a "Hey, I know we're not close, but I didn't forget." Instead, I got an email from Caroline that week. Not a personal one. A mass email, actually, sent to her subscribers about her latest brand partnership. She was going to Paris. Again, sponsored, all expenses paid. And of course, Mom was so proud. She even shared the email with a subject line that read, "Look what our girl's doing now." Our girl. I don't know what I was expecting when I drove over to Mom's that weekend. Maybe I wanted to say something to finally say, Do you even remember what day I was born? But when I walked in, the table was set. There were candles, wine glasses, and a small cake with Bon Voyage written across the top in pink icing. Caroline was there in a white sundress, tan from her recent trip to Malibu, already taking selfies with the cake in the background. I hovered by the kitchen, waiting for someone to look at me and realize, waiting for the moment someone would say, "Oh my God, your birthday was 3 days ago." It never came. Dinner passed in a blur. There were toasts, laughter. Caroline shared her itinerary, Fashion Week, hotel collabs, a Parisian skincare brand that's dying to work with her. I nodded, smiled, even complimented her dress. At one point, Mom asked if I was seeing anyone yet. And when I said no, she sighed and said, "Well, some women are just more independent. That's okay." Then, after dessert, when the plates were cleared and the wine was half gone, Mom disappeared into the kitchen. When she returned, she carried 2 mugs of tea, one for me, one for Caroline. She set mine down in front of me and paused, just for a moment, looked at me maybe for the first time all night. "I know I messed up," she said, quiet. Not quite apologetic, more resigned. I smiled, and then I reached for the cup, not mine, Caroline's. I switched them gently, without a word. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't angry, it was almost maternal, the way I did it. Like I was saving her from something. And when Caroline picked up the tea and took that first sip, I felt absolutely nothing. Not anger, not guilt, just stillness. 2 sips in, she started coughing. At first it was small, a tickle in the throat, then more aggressive, then violent. Mom jumped up, panicked, knocking over a glass. Caroline clutched her chest, her lips parting, eyes wide with fear. Her voice cracked. She was trying to say something, but it didn't come out. I sat there, calm, watching, and I didn't flinch, not once. I remember thinking, as I drove back to Mom's house that evening, that perhaps I was being unfair. Perhaps I had let old wounds fester too long, let them whisper in my ear until even basic gestures felt like manipulations. Perhaps, just this once, Mom had genuinely remembered, and the invitation wasn't a trap cloaked in floral stationery and fake concern, but that flicker of hope, that small, stubborn flame that refuses to die in the hearts of neglected daughters. It was smothered the moment I walked through the door and saw the room already spinning in celebration. The kitchen smelled like rosemary chicken and white wine, the kind of comfort meal Mom always reserved for special occasions. And the dining table, set for 6, was crowded with bright tulips, gold-rimmed plates, and a small pastel-colored cake that read in perfect cursive, "Bon voyage, Caroline?" I didn't even have to ask what the occasion was. It hung in the air like perfume. Obvious, perfunctory, staged. Caroline was going to Paris, again. This time, she'd been handpicked by some new, sustainable fashion label that promised to bring elegance back to eco-conscious couture, or whatever nonsense they wrote in their press release. She beamed when she saw me, arms flung open like we were best friends who talked every day and shared each other's secrets instead of sisters who hadn't spoken in weeks. Unless Mom forced it. She kissed both my cheeks like some kind of influencer stereotype and gushed, "I'm so glad you could come. Mom said you were swamped with work stuff." I didn't correct her. Mom didn't say anything to me. I just nodded and smiled and took off my coat like I hadn't just walked into another party that had nothing to do with me. Dinner moved fast after that. Maybe because I wasn't fully present, or maybe because everything already felt rehearsed. The wine was poured, compliments were tossed around like croutons, and Caroline, of course, dominated the conversation with the natural ease of someone who had never in her life been required to shrink herself to make others comfortable. She told us about the Paris itinerary, the photographers she'd be working with, the boutique hotel nestled somewhere near the Seine that offered her a 2-week suite in exchange for 5 Instagram posts and a blog feature. Every time she said the word exclusive, Mom practically lit up like a Christmas tree, clapping her hands and saying things like, "That's my girl," or No one deserves this more. I kept my hands folded in my lap, not out of politeness, but to keep them from shaking with a rage so old it had become part of my bones. I waited for the turn, that moment where someone would say, "By the way, Heather, wasn't your birthday last week?" Or, "Did you do anything fun to celebrate?" But it never came. The topic stayed stubbornly orbiting around Caroline. Her trip, her followers, her collaborations, her dreams, her dreams, her dreams. It was like I didn't exist outside the role of spectator. And that was the thing about my family. They never insulted you outright. They never raised their voices or threw dishes. They cut you down with silence, with the strategic withholding of attention, with the way their eyes glazed over the moment you began to speak. At one point, I made a joke, a dry, self-deprecating line about being the only woman in the room who still paid for her own skincare. And Mom chuckled politely before changing the subject back to Caroline's upcoming shoot near the Eiffel Tower. That was the real skill she had, my mother. The ability to deflect with sweetness, to steer the ship gently back toward the child who had always been her pride, leaving the other drifting somewhere off-screen, unmoored and quiet. I excused myself after dessert, not because I had to use the bathroom, but because I needed a second to breathe, to remind myself that I wasn't 13 anymore and didn't have to stand there hoping for scraps. In the hallway, I stood near the front window, listening to their muffled laughter from the dining room, the clinking of wine glasses, the thrum of a life I was only ever allowed to watch. I looked at the framed pictures on the wall: Caroline at prom, Caroline at graduation, Caroline at New York Fashion Week. There were no photos of me past high school. The last one was me at 17, arms awkwardly around my science fair project, with a smile so forced it looked painful. When I returned, the table was cleared, and Mom was in the kitchen boiling water for tea. She looked up as I entered and gave me that tight, apologetic smile that always came just before she tried to act like nothing had happened. "I made chamomile," she said, reaching for 2 mugs. "Figured we could talk a bit, just us girls." And just like that, I was 13 again, desperate to believe the lie that this moment was special, that this meant something. I watched her pour the water, add honey to both cups, just a teaspoon like she used to do when we were sick, and stir with the same old spoon that clinked like a memory. She handed me 1 mug and kept the other for Caroline, who had just returned from the bathroom and was chatting on her phone, completely oblivious to the sudden shift in atmosphere. Then, as if she remembered she was supposed to say something meaningful, Mom set her cup down and looked me in the eye for the first time all night. "I know I messed up," she said. No context, no specifics, just those 5 words. And in that moment, something inside me crystallized. Not broke, not shattered, but hardened into a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I smiled. I picked up Caroline's cup, switched it with mine. Not because I planned anything, not because I had slipped something into the tea, but because I wanted her to feel what it was like, just once, to receive something not meant for her, and I wanted Mom to watch it happen. Caroline didn't notice the switch. She sipped, still texting, still smiling. I sipped my water and waited. It's strange how slow time becomes when something finally breaks, not in a dramatic, shattering way, but in that quiet, undeniable shift. When the world bends just slightly out of alignment, when all the little moments that were dismissed, swallowed, rationalized for the sake of family unity, begin to replay themselves in perfect clarity inside your mind like a reel that had been rolling silently in the background for decades, waiting for the moment you were finally still enough to hear it. That's what happened when Caroline took that second sip. The air in the room didn't change instantly. No alarms went off. No one screamed. It started subtly, the way all real consequences do, quietly, innocently, a slight hesitation in her breath, a tiny twitch of her mouth, as if she were about to speak but forgot the words. A glance toward her cup as though something had tasted off but not enough to say anything out loud. She coughed once, just once. That kind of delicate, throat-clearing sound people make when they've been laughing too hard, or when tea goes down the wrong pipe. Mom looked up with a smile, one hand still wrapped around her mug like a scene out of a commercial for generational warmth, and asked, "Too hot, sweetheart?" In that sing-song tone she reserved exclusively for Caroline. Caroline shook her head, waved a hand like it was nothing, and then took another sip, a deeper one this time, like she was determined to prove it was all fine, like her own body wasn't already staging a silent revolt she hadn't yet been informed about. I watched her, not out of malice, not with any twisted satisfaction or cartoonish glee, but with the kind of detached curiosity you reserve for dominoes you didn't push, but certainly lined up. She blinked rapidly, her eyes beginning to gloss just slightly at the corners, her breath shallower now, as though each inhale had to sneak past a growing tightness she couldn't quite explain. Her phone slipped from her hand and landed face down on the floor with a soft thud. That was the moment when silence became tension, when Mom's posture shifted just enough for the spell to crack. "Caroline?" she said, a little sharper now, the warmth pulled taut. "Honey, are you all right?" And then the real panic arrived. Slow but undeniable, like a tide rushing in with no intention of going back out. Caroline coughed again, harder this time, doubled over slightly in her chair, one hand pressed against her chest, the other fumbling clumsily for the edge of the table. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but only a hoarse, breathless gasp came out, her throat clearly closing in on itself, tightening like a vice, her face flushed deep red, then blotchy with patches of pale, rising up from her collarbone like bruises forming in reverse. She looked straight at me for the first time that night, not with fear, not with accusation, but confusion. A childlike, stunned bewilderment that said, "Why me?" And I held her gaze, calm, steady. I didn't flinch, not because I was trying to be strong or cold or theatrical, but because my face didn't know how to do anything else anymore. It had spent too many years smiling through stories about Caroline's latest achievements, nodding at dinners where my own name was barely mentioned, blinking away tears in cars parked down the block from my childhood home because I didn't want to ruin her big night. If I flinched now, it would imply this wasn't the inevitable end of something long overdue. Mom dropped her mug. It shattered on the hardwood floor like punctuation, like a long, jagged exclamation point at the end of a sentence no one wanted to read. She lunged toward Caroline, hands trembling, voice cracking, the edges of her composure fraying faster than I'd ever seen before. "Oh my God, Caroline, breathe, look at me, breathe, baby, breathe." Dad finally stood up. That alone was shocking. Dad, the ever-neutral observer, the man whose greatest parental contribution was "let's not make a scene." His chair scraped violently against the floor as he stumbled toward the kitchen, yelling something about Benadryl, about calling 911, his voice booming and useless and late. And still I sat there, still, present, watching. It was the paramedics who broke the trance. Their arrival filled the house with noise again. Purposeful noise. The kind of clatter that makes you move even if your instincts tell you to freeze. They burst in with equipment and urgency, knelt beside Caroline, asked questions in rapid succession, none of which I answered because I wasn't spoken to. Mom answered everything between sobs, hands fluttering like broken wings as she tried to recall what exactly had been in the tea. "Just chamomile," she said. "Organic, I think. From that shop by the lake, the one with the little jars. I didn't do anything to it, I swear." They injected her with something. One of them mentioned an allergic reaction. Severe, but not lethal. Not yet. They stabilized her. Caroline began to breathe again, though it sounded like sandpaper scraping through a straw, and her eyes rolled slightly back into her head from whatever sedative they'd given her. Mom asked if she would be okay. The paramedic nodded, said something about observation and taking her to the hospital just to be safe. No one asked about the switch. No one asked if maybe, just maybe, something had gone wrong before the mug was ever set down. And me? I waited until the noise faded, until the flashing lights blinked down the driveway, and until the house was quiet again. Just Mom in the kitchen wiping at the shattered ceramic, Dad sitting on the couch as if he might disappear into it, if he sat still long enough, and me standing at the edge of the dining room table, staring at the untouched piece of cake still sitting on my plate. I picked up my purse, walked to the door, and paused only once, to glance back at Mom, whose face was pale and distant, the same woman who had poured the tea and said, "I know I messed up," but didn't even have the language to say what exactly she was apologizing for. I wanted her to ask. I wanted her to look me in the eye and say, "Did you do something?" But she didn't. She couldn't. So I left. And when I got home, I opened my laptop, cleared my browser history, and slept better than I had in years. When people say they remember everything, what they usually mean is they remember the feeling, the sting, the silence, the cold edge of a phrase that didn't land like it should have, or a moment that should have felt like love, but settled into the bones more like absence. That's what remembering is for someone like me, not a timeline of events, but a museum of emotional bruises, cataloged by temperature, volume, facial expression, and the quiet throb of something that didn't feel fair. And when I stood in the hallway outside my own apartment the day after the tea, keys still clutched in my hand, jacket half zipped like I couldn't quite decide whether I was coming or going, the voicemail blinking on my phone felt like one of those moments that would get its own exhibit one day, somewhere deep in the wing marked "Final Straw." I didn't listen to it right away. I stood there for a while instead, frozen in that strange post-impact fog, the kind that follows after something enormous happens. Not a scream, not a fight, not a declaration, but something quieter, something insidious, like the slow turning of a wheel you hadn't realized was connected to everything. When I finally pressed play, I expected rage. I expected screaming or crying or some combination of both. Maybe accusations, maybe even threats. But Mom's voice, as usual, betrayed nothing except the same calculated concern she always summoned when she knew she'd failed but didn't want to admit it outright. "We know what you did," she said, not shouted, not wept, just said, calm, controlled. "We just don't know why." I played it again, just to be sure, same words, same tone, like she was telling me I'd left the garage door open, like my sister gasping for air, like a night spent in the ER under supervision, like paramedics hauling Caroline's limp body out of a suburban kitchen. None of it had earned even the courtesy of emotional realism. And that, more than anything, told me this wasn't about the tea. This wasn't about what happened. It was about the illusion I'd broken, the perfect hierarchy of our family where Caroline sparkled and I stayed useful. I poured a glass of wine, sat on the couch, and let the memories come. Not the big ones, but the ones that always got glossed over because they weren't dramatic enough to count as trauma, yet sharp enough to cut anyway. I remembered my 14th birthday. Not the party itself because there wasn't one, but the way Mom told me we'd have to postpone, just for now, because Caroline had a fever. The way Dad said, "We'll make it up to you next weekend," even though next weekend came and went, swallowed by Caroline's ballet recital and a family trip to the lake. I remembered getting my acceptance letter to college and showing it to Mom while she was icing cupcakes for Caroline's 16th birthday, her only response being, "That's nice, sweetie. Can you help me with the frosting?" I remembered the night Caroline called me in tears because a brand had dropped her over a comment she'd made online. Something about sustainability being a vibe rather than a science, and how I'd stayed up until 3 a.m. writing an apology statement she could post. She never even credited me, just sent a heart emoji. But the memory that kept coming back, looping like a broken track, was from when I was 9 and Caroline was 3, long before influencers, long before brand deals, long before I even knew what resentment really was. We were in the backyard, and Caroline had stolen my birthday tiara, plastic, cheap, but precious to me. I'd asked Mom to make her give it back. Instead, she crouched down, tucked a piece of Caroline's hair behind her ear, and said, "Let her wear it. She looks like such a little princess." I remember standing there, barefoot in the grass, watching my little sister twirl in something that was mine, and hearing Mom's voice float toward me again. Be the big girl, Heather. She's just playing. Playing. That's what Caroline was always doing. Playing with people, with appearances, with roles she could slip into and out of like a well-cut dress. And I was always the audience, the understudy, the one backstage holding everyone's coats. That night, after letting the voicemail ring inside my head for hours, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out the old family photo albums, the real ones, not the curated social media versions, and went page by page. Me in pigtails, holding my first science trophy. Caroline, front and center at every birthday party. Me, high school graduation, standing alone by the bleachers while Mom tried to get a better angle of Caroline hugging one of my teachers. The pattern was so obvious, I almost laughed. But what struck me wasn't just how often I'd been cropped out of the center. It was how comfortable I had become with standing on the margins. And yet, in all those memories, one thing stood out. I had always shown up. Always. I'd clapped, smiled, sent flowers, loaned money, offered silence when silence was asked of me. The night Caroline stole my boyfriend in college, because yes, that happened too, I didn't confront her. I didn't even cry. I just transferred campuses and never mentioned his name again. When Mom asked me why I'd broken up with him, I shrugged and said we grew apart. Caroline never admitted it, never apologized. Just told me 6 months later that she and Ryan were trying things out. I said nothing, so when I stood in front of the mirror that night, brushing my teeth like nothing had happened, I finally understood the difference between being a good person and being a quiet one. I'd spent so long thinking silence was grace, that restraint was maturity, that letting people hurt you without consequence made you the bigger person. But all it really did was teach them they could. I didn't plan what happened with the tea, not exactly. I didn't crush pills in the dark or research allergic reactions or study her medical files, though it would have been easy. I work with enough data to make things look like accidents, but I didn't have to, because Caroline was careless, always had been. She had that ridiculous immune protocol for her throat-clearing brand deal that one time, an essential oils thing. And she told me last year, laughing over wine, that chamomile made her tongue feel like a balloon in a sock. It wasn't deadly, just irritating. Super weird, she'd said. My body hates it, so I just avoid it. So I didn't poison her, I didn't lace the cup, I didn't even choose the tea. Mom did that. Caroline drank it. And I just didn't stop her. There are moments, small, almost imperceptible moments, when the way someone looks at you changes forever. And no matter how many apologies are uttered, no matter how many explanations are offered, no matter how many warm dinners or pleasant phone calls follow, in the weeks or years to come, the image has already cemented itself in their eyes, and you will never again be simply who you were. You will always also be the version of you that did not flinch. That is what I saw in my mother's expression when I walked back into her house, 3 days after the incident, summoned by a message that read only, "We need to talk. Come alone." There was no exclamation point, no urgency, no affection, just that dry, brittle authority that had always existed in her voice, the tone of a woman who expected compliance simply because she had spoken. The house was dim when I arrived. It was early evening, the sky outside that heavy shade of blue that looks almost black at the edges, the kind of color that makes everything inside feel colder by contrast. The lights in the kitchen were on, soft and yellow, casting long shadows across the counters, and I stood in the doorway for several seconds, letting the silence stretch long enough to make her uncomfortable, which it didn't. She was already seated at the kitchen table, hands folded in front of her, no tea this time, no wine, just that expression I had seen only once before, the day she came home from the hospital. After my father's stroke, eyes wide and vacant, because something she had relied on without gratitude had finally stopped working. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't offer me a seat. She just looked at me, hard, like she was trying to find someone behind my face that made more sense to her. "You're not going to tell me it was an accident, are you?" she said, her voice brittle and empty of pretense. I could have played dumb. I could have tilted my head and asked her what she meant. I could have taken the easy route, pretended Caroline had simply grabbed the wrong mug, that I hadn't noticed, that the reaction was unfortunate and tragic and nobody's fault, really. But something about the quiet in that room, the ache in it, the way it seemed to echo with all the things we hadn't said over the years, made dishonesty feel like a betrayal to myself. So I didn't lie. I didn't confess either. I said nothing, which was worse. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She simply shook her head slowly, like something had cracked in a place too deep for repair. "I don't know what I did to make you hate her so much," she murmured, not quite looking at me now. Or maybe I do, maybe I just don't want to admit it. I didn't answer because there was nothing she could say now that would change the truth. I had never hated Caroline. I had hated the imbalance, the blindness, the way one child was allowed to bloom without consequence while the other was asked to prune herself down to something smaller, more manageable, more convenient. I had hated the way my needs were always labeled as complaints, my boundaries as bitterness, my silence as grace. I had hated the fact that the one time I broke the pattern, not with violence, not with malice, but with a simple decision to not interfere, the world finally noticed I existed. She asked then, her voice barely above a whisper, the question they all ask eventually, the one people think will unlock the truth like a key. "Did you mean to hurt her?" And I wanted for one absurd second to laugh, because what a foolish question that is in a family like ours. As if intent matters more than impact. As if the daily quiet erasures I'd endured weren't a form of harm. As if handing someone a cup of tea was more violent than making them disappear inside their own home. So I looked her in the eye and said clearly and calmly, "I didn't stop her." The silence that followed was longer than anything I'd ever endured with her. Not because she was angry, but because she understood. Finally, she understood that I hadn't snapped, hadn't plotted, hadn't poisoned. I had simply withdrawn the one thing I'd always offered without thanks. My vigilance, my care, my loyalty. I had let the cards fall where they would and refused for once to clean up the mess. I left without saying goodbye. There was nothing left in that house that I needed. No apology would rewrite the last 34 years, and no sudden outpouring of love would erase the miles of silence that had paved the road here. But as I stepped outside, the cool air wrapped around me like a secret only I knew, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel angry or invisible or resentful. I felt clean, not healed, but clean. Later that night, while brushing my teeth, I remembered something Caroline had said months ago at some family brunch. Something about how a rival influencer had been caught faking parts of her resume, including a made-up degree and a charity partnership that didn't exist. Brand killer, she'd called it. All it takes is one email to the right person and poof, sponsorships vanish. I opened my laptop. I found the website for the fashion label she'd been collaborating with, the one sponsoring her Paris trip, the one whose logo she plastered across every third post like a badge of validation. I clicked the contact tab. I wrote the email in 10 minutes. Short, polite, anonymous, outlining discrepancies I knew existed in her media kit, the ones she'd boasted about tweaking to seem more exclusive. I didn't lie. I just passed along what she had once drunkenly bragged about to me on our mother's deck. By morning, the Paris trip had been canceled. Caroline's Instagram was quiet for the first time in years. Mom didn't call. No one did. And that was when I understood something that made my spine straighten just slightly, with a satisfaction I wasn't proud of, but couldn't deny. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one holding silence. I wasn't the invisible one. I was the absence they all finally noticed. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.